Worthless trailer trash, she spat, her perfectly manicured finger pointing at me like I was something she'd scraped off her designer shoe. That's all you'll ever be, Samantha, and everyone in this neighborhood knows it. The words hit me like a physical blow, lodging in my chest like the tip of a needle, but what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I owned every single house she was so desperately trying to fit into. But let me back up, because this story doesn't start with that moment of cruelty, though it certainly reaches its crescendo there. This story starts 37 years ago when I was a young woman with calloused hands and a dream bigger than the double-wide trailer I called home. It starts with a promise I made to myself while scrubbing other people's floors and watching their children that someday, I would never have to bow my head to anyone again. My name is Samantha Eleanor Hartwell, though for most of my adult life I've been Samantha Sinclair, taking my late husband Matthew's name when we married in 1987. I'm 71 years old now, and if you saw me at the grocery store or the post office, you'd probably think I was just another widow living quietly on a fixed income. My silver hair is always neat but not styled by expensive salons. My clothes are clean and pressed but not fashionable, and I drive a 12-year-old Honda Civic that still runs perfectly well, thank you very much. I live in a modest ranch house on Maple Street in Willowbrook Heights, one of those suburban developments where the houses all look similar enough to suggest prosperity, but different enough to avoid the cookie-cutter stigma. What you wouldn't know, what none of my neighbors or my daughter-in-law or even my own son fully understood until recently, is that I own 17 properties in this neighborhood. 17. Not as investments that I brag about at dinner parties, not as some flashy display of wealth, but as quiet, methodical building of security that began when I was 22 years old and determined never to be powerless again. You see, I grew up in Willowbrook Estates, the mobile home park that sits just outside the city limits, the place that people like my daughter-in-law refer to with barely concealed disgust as the trailer park. My mother raised 5 children in a double-wide that she somehow managed to keep clean and cheerful despite my father's drinking and the constant worry about money. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses during the day and stocking shelves at the grocery store 3 nights a week, and she never once complained, at least not where we could hear her. But I could see the weariness in her shoulders, the way she'd pause sometimes while folding laundry, just staring out the window at the neat suburban houses in the distance, and I knew she was dreaming of something different. When I was 16, I started working at those same houses my mother cleaned, learning the routes and routines, earning the trust of families who barely noticed I existed, as long as their floors were spotless and their children were fed. I was invisible to them, which turned out to be an education in itself. I learned how they talked about money, how they made decisions, how they built their lives on foundations I was determined to understand. I listened to their phone calls about investments and property taxes and mortgage rates, filing away information like other teenagers collected magazine clippings or concert tickets. Matthew found me attractive despite my background, or maybe because of it. I never was entirely sure which, and by the time I might have thought to ask, it no longer seemed to matter. He was a good man, steady and kind, who worked as a supervisor at the telecommunications company and believed in living below your means and saving for the future. He respected my work ethic, admired my determination to better myself, and never once made me feel ashamed of where I came from. When we married, I had already saved $8,000, an enormous sum for a 19-year-old who'd grown up poor, and Matthew had $12,000 of his own. We pooled our resources and bought our first house together, a small starter home in need of cosmetic work that we tackled ourselves on weekends. But that first house wasn't enough for me. While Matthew was content to settle into middle-class comfort, I was quietly building something else. I kept working, cleaning houses, then managing properties for other people, then eventually running my own small property management business, and every dollar I could spare went toward real estate. Not flashy commercial buildings or trendy condos, but solid residential properties in good school districts, the kind of places where families would stay for years and pay their rent on time. Matthew knew about the business, of course, but I don't think he ever fully grasped the scope of what I was building. Men of his generation often smiled indulgently when their wives had little businesses, and while he was proud of my success, he preferred to focus on his own work and leave the details to me, which suited me perfectly. I had learned early that invisible power was often the most effective kind, and I had no interest in drawing attention to myself or my growing portfolio of properties. Our son Michael was born in 1989, a beautiful baby who grew into a sweet-natured boy and then into a young man who somehow inherited his father's contentment without my drive. Michael was never ambitious in the way I understood ambition. He was happy to work his maintenance job at the school district, happy to live in the same town where he'd grown up, happy to assume that life would simply unfold for him without requiring the kind of strategic planning that had shaped my entire adult existence. I loved him desperately, but I sometimes worried that I had made his life too easy, too comfortable, too free from the kind of necessity that had forged my own strength. When Michael was 28, he married Jessica Pierce, and that's where this story truly begins. Jessica was 25, pretty in that polished way that required considerable time and money to maintain, and she had very clear ideas about what her life should look like. She had grown up in Willowbrook Heights, in one of the larger houses with the circular driveways and the professionally landscaped yards, and she had every intention of maintaining that standard of living, preferably improving upon it. She was not pleased to discover that her new husband's mother lived in what she considered a starter house and had worked as a cleaning lady for most of her adult life. From the beginning, Jessica made it clear that she found my background embarrassing. Not in so many words, of course. She was too well-bred for that kind of direct cruelty, at least in the early years. Instead, she expressed her disapproval through 1,000 small cuts. The way she'd change the subject when other people asked about my work, the way she'd insist on hosting family gatherings at her house instead of mine piqué, the way she'd introduce me to her friends as Michael's mother without any other identifying information, as if my occupation or interests were somehow unseemly. I tolerated it because I loved my son, and because I had learned long ago that some battles aren't worth fighting, and because I was genuinely curious to see how far she would push the boundaries of acceptable behavior. I had dealt with entitled people my entire working life. I understood the psychology of those who believed that their circumstances made them inherently superior to others, and I knew that such people often revealed their true character when they felt safe to do so. For 12 years, I watched Jessica systematically attempt to erase me from my son's life. She scheduled family vacations during holidays so that Michael couldn't visit me. She planned elaborate birthday parties for my grandchildren. Yes, I have 2 grandchildren, Emma, who's now 11, and David, who's 9, but somehow never managed to give me adequate notice, so I'd arrive to find the party already in full swing and no place set for me at the table. She bought expensive gifts for the children and then mentioned casually that some people might feel that their own modest presence looked shabby by comparison, suggesting that perhaps I should consider just giving money instead of trying to compete. But the real pattern of cruelty emerged around my grandchildren. Jessica made it clear that she considered me an unsuitable influence on Emma and David, too rough around the edges, too likely to fill their heads with what she called inappropriate ideas about work and money. She limited my visits to brief supervised encounters, usually in public places where I couldn't have meaningful conversations with the children or share the kinds of stories and wisdom that grandparents traditionally pass down. When Emma asked me once about my work, about why I went to so many different houses during the week, Jessica quickly intervened with a bright, artificial laugh and a comment about how Grandma Samantha has always been very busy with her little jobs. Her little jobs, as if the business I had built from nothing, the portfolio of properties that generated more annual income than Michael and Jessica's combined salaries, the financial security I had created through decades of careful planning and hard work, was some kind of quaint hobby that she could dismiss with a patronizing smile. I began to understand that Jessica wasn't just embarrassed by my background. She was actively working to diminish my relationship with my own family. She wanted Michael and the children to see me as she saw me, as someone whose love and presence were burdens to be managed rather than gifts to be treasured. She was systematically teaching my grandchildren that their grandmother was someone to be politely tolerated rather than genuinely welcomed, and she was doing it so skillfully that even Michael didn't seem to notice the pattern. Matthew passed away 4 years ago, a sudden heart attack that left me widowed at 67 and more alone than I had ever expected to be. The grief was devastating, but what made it worse was the way Jessica used my loss as an opportunity to further limit my access to my family. During the funeral arrangements, she took control with characteristic efficiency, making decisions about the service and the reception without consulting me, explaining to anyone who asked that I was too overwhelmed to handle the details. When people brought food to the house afterward, she intercepted them at the door and directed them to take everything to her house instead, because Samantha needs her rest, and we don't want him to burden her with entertaining. The truth was that I needed my family around me. I needed the comfort of people sharing stories about Matthew, the familiar chaos of grandchildren underfoot, the sense that life would continue despite the enormous hole that his death had left in my world. But Jessica had effectively isolated me from my own husband's funeral reception, turning what should have been a gathering of mutual support into another opportunity to position herself as the responsible family member while casting me as the fragile widow who needed to be managed rather than comforted. After Matthew's death, I threw myself even more deeply into my work, partly because it gave me something to focus on besides my grief, and partly because I was beginning to understand that my financial independence might be the only protection I had against Jessica's escalating campaign to marginalize me. I expanded my property management business, bought 2 more rental houses, and began making strategic improvements to my existing properties that would increase their long-term value. I was methodical about it, the way I had always been methodical about building security, but now there was an urgency that hadn't been there before. I was preparing for something, though I wasn't entirely sure what. The breaking point came 6 months ago during what was supposed to be a family barbecue at Michael and Jessica's house. It was Emma's 11th birthday, and I had been invited, though Jessica made it clear that I should arrive after the other guests and leave before the cleanup. I brought Emma a beautiful set of art supplies, good quality materials, not toys, because she had shown real talent and interest in drawing, and I was looking forward to spending a few hours with my grandchildren in a relaxed setting. But when I arrived, it became clear that Jessica had orchestrated the gathering specifically to humiliate me. She had invited several of her friends, women who lived in the most expensive houses in the neighborhood, and she had spent the afternoon regaling them with stories about my colorful background and my fascinating journey from poverty to, well, relative comfort. She was performing for them, using my life story as entertainment, painting herself as the generous daughter-in-law who had graciously accepted her husband's family despite their obvious shortcomings. I stood in her backyard holding my granddaughter's gift, listening to Jessica describe my mother's mobile home as if it were some kind of exotic anthropological discovery, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly. I had been angry before, many times, and anger was a temporary emotion that burned bright and then faded. This was something colder and more permanent, a recognition that I had been foolish to think that tolerance and patience would eventually win Jessica's respect, or at least her basic human decency. The conversation continued around me, with Jessica's friends asking increasingly pointed questions about my background, my work, my current living situation. They weren't mean-spirited questions necessarily, but they were asked with the kind of fascinated curiosity that people reserve for discussing someone else's misfortune, and Jessica was clearly enjoying her role as the translator between their world and mine. She explained that I lived very simply now, that I had scaled back my work after Matthew's death, that I was finding ways to stay busy in my retirement. It was all technically true, and it was completely false. Yes, I lived simply because I had learned that happiness and security didn't require expensive furniture or luxury cars. Yes, I had scaled back some aspects of my work because I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, including myself. And yes, I was staying busy, but not in the way she implied. Not as an elderly woman desperately filling empty hours, but as a successful businesswoman managing a substantial portfolio of properties and investments. But the final straw came when Emma approached me with her new art supplies, her face bright, with excitement, wanting to show me a drawing she had made. Jessica immediately swooped in, taking the art supplies from Emma's hands and setting them aside. "Oh, sweetheart, those are very nice, but they're probably too advanced for you right now. Why don't you go play with the other children, and maybe Grandma Samantha can tell you some stories about when she used to clean houses. I'm sure she has lots of interesting stories about the different families she worked for." The way she said it, used to clean houses, as if it were something shameful to be whispered about rather than honest work to be respected. The way she dismissed the gift I had carefully chosen for my granddaughter, not because it was inappropriate, but because it came from me. The way she used my own history as a weapon to diminish me in front of my grandchild, teaching Emma that her grandmother's work was something to be embarrassed about rather than proud of. I looked around that backyard at the house that Michael and Jessica could afford because of the down payment I had quietly provided them, at the neighbors who had no idea that their own homes were part of my investment portfolio, at my daughter-in-law who was so confident in her superiority that she felt safe to publicly humiliate me, and I made a decision that had been building for years. I would not tolerate this anymore. But I didn't make a scene. I didn't raise my voice or defend myself or try to explain to Jessica's friends who I really was or what I had accomplished. Instead, I smiled pleasantly, kissed my grandchildren goodbye, and left the party exactly when Jessica had suggested I should. I drove home to my modest ranch house on Maple Street, sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and my laptop, and began making phone calls. You see, what Jessica didn't know, what none of them knew, was that over the course of 37 years, I had quietly become one of the largest private property owners in Willowbrook Heights. Not the mobile home park where I'd grown up, but the prestigious subdivision where Jessica had spent her entire life, where she had built her identity around belonging to an exclusive community of successful families. I owned the Patterson house on Elm Street, where Jessica's best friend Linda lived with her investment banker husband. I owned the Johnson property on Oak Avenue, where the neighborhood association president held his monthly meetings about property values and community standards. I owned the Mitchell house on Birch Lane, where Jessica had attended countless dinner parties and book club meetings over the years. I owned the corner lot where the expensive landscaping company stored their equipment, and the rental property where the young couple who babysat Emma and David were struggling to pay their monthly rent. 17 properties in total, acquired carefully and quietly over more than 3 decades, managed through a discreet property management company that I had established under my maiden name, Hartwell Holdings. None of my tenants knew that their elderly landlord was the woman they occasionally saw at the grocery store or the library. None of Jessica's friends knew that their monthly rent checks were ultimately deposited into my accounts. None of them had any idea that the woman they had spent the afternoon discussing as if she were an interesting but inferior species had the power to significantly impact their daily lives. But I was about to change that. My first call was to my attorney, Mark Gray, who had been handling my business affairs for 15 years and was one of the few people who fully understood the scope of my holdings. I explained the situation to him carefully, not the emotional aspects but the practical implications, and I asked him to begin the process of transferring the management of my properties from Hartwell Holdings to a new company that would operate under my married name, Sinclair Properties. I wanted every tenant, every neighbor, every person in Jessica's social circle to receive official notice that their landlord was Samantha Eleanor Sinclair, and I wanted that transition to happen as quickly as possible. My second call was to my accountant, Patricia Moss, who had been helping me manage my investments for the past decade. I asked her to prepare a complete financial statement showing the current value of my real estate portfolio, my liquid assets, and my projected annual income from all sources. I wanted documentation, official paperwork that would make it impossible for anyone to dismiss my financial situation as getting by on Social Security and savings. My third call was to my property management company, instructing them to schedule inspections of all 17 properties within the next month. Not because there were any problems, but because I wanted to reestablish personal oversight of my investments. I wanted to walk through each house, review each lease agreement, and make sure that every tenant understood exactly who they were dealing with. And my fourth call was to Michael. "Mom?" His voice was concerned when he answered, probably because I rarely called him in the evening and never on the day of family gatherings. "Is everything okay? Jessica said you left the party early." "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said, using the tone I had perfected over decades of managing difficult situations without revealing my own emotional state. "I was wondering if you could come by tomorrow afternoon. There are some things about your father's estate and my business affairs that I need to discuss with you." There was a pause, and I could almost hear him thinking through the implications of my request. Michael had always been content to remain uninformed about financial matters, trusting that his parents had everything under control, but he was intelligent enough to recognize when something significant was happening. "Of course," he said finally. "Should I bring Jessica?" "No," I said, my voice perfectly calm and reasonable. "This is a conversation between you and me. Family business, you understand." After I hung up the phone, I sat in my quiet kitchen for a long time, thinking about the choices that had brought me to this moment. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was a luxury I couldn't afford, and it clouded judgment in ways that I had learned to avoid. Instead, I felt the kind of cold clarity that came from finally understanding exactly what needed to be done and having the tools to do it. I had spent 12 years trying to win Jessica's acceptance through patience and kindness, hoping that eventually she would recognize my worth as a mother-in-law and a grandmother. I had tolerated her condescension, her attempts to marginalize me, her systematic campaign to diminish my relationship with my own family, because I believed that love and persistence would eventually overcome her prejudices. But I had been wrong. Jessica's cruelty wasn't based on misunderstanding or insecurity. It was based on a fundamental belief that some people were inherently superior to others, and that superiority gave her the right to treat me as if I were something less than fully human. She didn't want to accept me into her world. She wanted to keep me in what she saw as my proper place, grateful for whatever scraps of attention she chose to throw my way. The next morning, I began what I privately thought of as my education campaign. I started with a visit to Patricia Moss's office, where I reviewed my complete financial picture and requested printed copies of every relevant document. The numbers were even more impressive on paper than they had been in my head. 17 properties worth a combined total of $4.2 million, generating annual rental income of $180,000, plus additional income from my property management business and my various investment accounts. My net worth was approaching $5 million, and my annual income was more than 3 times what Michael and Jessica earned together. I wasn't bragging to myself. I had never been the type of person who derives satisfaction from accumulating wealth for its own sake. But I was realizing for the first time just how successfully I had achieved the goal I had set for myself as a young woman. I would never again be powerless, never again be at the mercy of people who believed that their circumstances made them inherently better than me. From Patricia's office, I drove to Mark Gray's law firm, where we discussed the legal implications of what I was planning. David was careful to explain that I had every right to manage my properties as I saw fit, to choose my own business structures, and to share or withhold information about my finances from anyone, including my family. He also made sure I understood that what I was contemplating wasn't revenge in any legal sense. It was simply transparency, a decision to stop hiding my success in order to make other people more comfortable. "You're not required to be invisible," he told me. And something about the way he said it made me realize that he understood exactly what I had been doing for all these years and why I was finally choosing to stop. That afternoon, Michael arrived at my house with the slightly anxious expression he wore whenever he suspected that adult responsibilities were about to be discussed. He had inherited his father's basic decency and his fundamental desire to avoid conflict, but he had also inherited a certain willingness to let other people handle the difficult decisions, which had served him well in most areas of his life, but had left him unprepared for situations that required taking sides. I served him coffee and homemade pound cake, his favorite since childhood, and we chatted about the children and his work for a few minutes before I got down to business. I had prepared carefully for this conversation, knowing that I would have only one chance to help Michael understand what had been happening in his family and why things needed to change. "I want to show you something," I said, opening the folder I had prepared with copies of my financial statements, property deeds, and business records. "I know your father and I never talked much about money with you, and that was probably a mistake. But I think it's time you understood what your inheritance will actually look like, and what I've been building all these years." Michael looked through the documents with increasing amazement, occasionally asking questions about specific properties or investment strategies, clearly struggling to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the business empire that was laid out in front of him. When he finished reading, he looked up at me with an expression that was equal parts pride and confusion. "Mom, this is incredible. You're actually wealthy, like really wealthy. Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because wealth isn't about the money you have, Kish," I said. "It's about the security you've built and the choices you can make. I didn't want you to grow up thinking that money was the most important thing in life, and I didn't want you to feel entitled to something you hadn't earned. But I also realize now that by keeping this information private, I may have inadvertently contributed to some misunderstandings about my situation." I let that hang in the air for a moment, watching Michael process the implications. He was a good man, but he wasn't naive, and I could see him beginning to understand how Jessica's treatment of me might look different in light of this new information. "Michael," I said gently, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you noticed the way Jessica talks about my background, the way she introduces me to people or discusses my work, or limits my time with the grandchildren?" He was quiet for a long time, staring down at the financial documents as if they might contain the answer to my question. When he finally looked up, his face was troubled in a way that told me he had been aware of the pattern, even if he hadn't been willing to acknowledge it. "I know she can be particular about social things," he said slowly, "and I know she has strong opinions about the kids' schedules and activities, but I assumed you understood that she just wanted what was best for everyone." "What she wanted was for me to stay in my place, Bicia," I said, my voice remaining calm even though I could feel the years of accumulated hurt rising in my chest. And my place, in her mind, was as the embarrassing mother-in-law who used to clean houses, and lived in a trailer park, someone to be managed and minimized and kept away from the people who matter. Michael's face went pale, and I could see him replaying years of family interactions through this new lens, recognizing patterns that he had been unconsciously trained to ignore or excuse. The birthday parties I hadn't been properly invited to, the holidays I had been excluded from, the countless small moments when Jessica had positioned herself as the reasonable adult dealing with his difficult mother. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said, and I could hear the genuine distress in his voice. "I didn't realize. I should have seen. You weren't supposed to see, I said. Jessica is very good at what she does. She never directly confronted me or openly disrespected me in front of you. She just created a situation where I was consistently marginalized, where my relationship with you and the children was constantly being managed and limited, where I was made to feel like a burden instead of a beloved family member. I reached across the table and took his hand, the way I had when he was a little boy struggling with a problem that seemed too big to solve. But here's what I want you to understand, sweetheart. This isn't about the money, not really. I could have lived comfortably on a fraction of what I have, and I would have been perfectly happy to be the modest widow that Jessica wanted me to be if she had treated me with basic kindness and respect, if she had welcomed me into your family instead of trying to erase me from it, if she had encouraged my relationship with my grandchildren instead of systematically undermining it. Michael was quiet again, processing not just the information, but the emotional weight of what I was telling him. I could see him struggling with the realization that he had allowed his wife to mistreat his mother for years, and that his own desire to avoid conflict had made him complicit in her behavior. "What are you going to do?" that he asked finally. "I'm going to stop hiding," I said. "I'm going to stop pretending to be less than I am in order to make other people comfortable. I'm going to manage my properties under my own name so that everyone in this neighborhood, including Jessica, knows exactly who they're dealing with. And I'm going to start insisting on the kind of relationship with my grandchildren that a grandmother deserves to have." I could see Michael working through the implications of what I was saying, understanding that his comfortable world was about to be significantly disrupted. But I could also see something else in his expression, a kind of relief, as if he had been waiting for someone to name the dysfunction that had been poisoning our family relationships for years. "She's not going to like this," he said quietly. "No," I agreed. "She's not. But Michael, I need you to understand something. I love you more than my own life, and I would do anything to protect your happiness. But I will not continue to sacrifice my relationship with my grandchildren, my dignity, and my place in this family just to preserve Jessica's fantasy that she's married above her circumstances." The conversation continued for another hour, with Michael asking practical questions about my business, my plans, and what this would mean for their family. I answered everything honestly, but I also made it clear that I wasn't asking for his permission or his approval. I was informing him of decisions I had already made, giving him the opportunity to prepare for the changes that were coming. When he left that afternoon, I could see that he was struggling with divided loyalties, torn between his love for me and his desire to maintain peace in his marriage. But I could also see that he was beginning to understand the price that our family had been paying for that peace, and that the cost had been almost entirely borne by me. Over the next 2 weeks, I systematically implemented my plan. I visited each of my 17 properties, introducing myself to tenants who had been sending their rent checks to an anonymous management company for years. I explained that I was transitioning to more direct oversight of my investments, and that they would be receiving new lease agreements and contact information reflecting the change. The reactions were fascinating to observe. Most of my tenants were simply surprised to discover that their soft-spoken elderly landlord was someone they had seen around the neighborhood for years. A few were impressed by the professional way I had been managing their properties without drawing attention to myself. But several, including Jessica's friend Linda Patterson and the neighborhood association president, Matthew Johnson, were clearly shocked to realize that the woman they had dismissed as a humble retiree was actually their landlord. I also arranged for new business cards, letterhead, and signage that clearly identified Sinclair Properties as my company. I wanted there to be no ambiguity about who owned what, no possibility for anyone to claim that they hadn't understood the scope of my holdings. The confrontation I had been anticipating came exactly 3 weeks after my conversation with Michael. I was in my front yard planting tulip bulbs for the spring when Jessica's BMW pulled into my driveway with the aggressive precision that suggested she was very angry about something. She got out of the car wearing her most expensive outfit, a combination that I recognized as her armor for important social confrontations, and walked toward me with the kind of determined stride that meant she had rehearsed this conversation and was confident about how it would go. "Samantha," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of artificial sweetness that I had learned to recognize as her most dangerous mood, "I think we need to have a talk." I stood up slowly, brushing the dirt off my gardening gloves, taking my time to meet her eyes. I had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and I felt remarkably calm, the way I always felt when I finally understood exactly what needed to be done. "Of course, Jessica Perillo," I said pleasantly. "Would you like to come inside, or shall we talk here?" Here's fine, boy, she said, clearly intending to keep this conversation brief and one-sided. I think you know why I'm here. I tilted my head slightly, as if I were genuinely puzzled by her statement. I'm afraid I don't. Why don't you tell me? Her composure slipped just slightly, a flash of irritation crossing her face, as she realized that I wasn't going to make this easy for her. You know perfectly well what you've been doing. Going around the neighborhood, talking to people, making claims about owning properties. It's embarrassing, Samantha. It's making Michael look bad, and it's confusing the children. I see, I said, my voice remaining perfectly calm. And what exactly do you think I should be doing instead? You should be acting your age, she said, her voice getting sharper as her frustration grew. You should be focusing on your hobbies and your volunteer work, and letting the adults handle the business matters. This whole fantasy about being some kind of property mogul is getting out of hand, and people are starting to talk. I studied her face for a moment, noting the way her perfectly applied makeup couldn't quite hide the anxiety in her eyes. She was worried about something specific, and I was beginning to understand what it was. Jessica, I said gently, are you concerned about what your friends are saying about you? This isn't about me, she snapped, but the defensive edge in her voice told me that I had identified exactly what was bothering her. This is about you making claims that you can't support and making our family look ridiculous in the process. What claims would those be? Oh, please, she said, her voice dripping with the kind of exasperated condescension that I had been tolerating for 12 years. Everyone knows that you worked as a cleaning lady your whole life. Everyone knows that you live in that tiny house and drive that old car because that's all you can afford. This sudden pretense that you're some kind of business owner is just... It's pathetic, Samantha. It's desperate and pathetic, and it needs to stop. I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had spent more than a decade systematically trying to diminish me, who had taught my grandchildren to be embarrassed by their grandmother, who had built her entire identity around the belief that she was inherently superior to people like me, and I realized that I wasn't angry anymore. I was almost sorry for her because she was about to discover just how wrong she had been about everything. Jessica, I said, my voice still calm, but carrying a new kind of authority that made her take a step back. I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you remember the house you lived in before you married Michael? The apartment on Elm Street? She looked confused by the change of subject, but nodded warily. Of course. What does that have to do with anything? Do you remember who your landlord was? Some management company, she said impatiently. Hartwell something. Samantha, I don't see what... Hartwell Holdings, I said quietly. Which is my company, Jessica. I was your landlord. I've been your friend Linda's landlord for 8 years. I'm Matthew Johnson's landlord. I own 17 properties in this neighborhood, including the house where you're planning to send Emma for piano lessons next month. The color drained from her face so quickly that I was momentarily concerned she might faint. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, her brain clearly struggling to process information that didn't fit with everything she thought she knew about the world. That's impossible, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. No, I said, reaching into my pocket for the folder I had prepared for this moment. It's just invisible, which is how I preferred it until recently. I handed her copies of the property deeds, the business registration documents, the financial statements that Mark Gray had helped me prepare. I watched her face change as she read through them, seeing her realize that everything she had believed about me, everything she had based her treatment of me on, had been completely wrong. You never told us, she said, and for the first time in our 12-year relationship, her voice held no trace of condescension or artificial sweetness. She sounded genuinely shocked, almost betrayed, as if I had somehow cheated by not conforming to her expectations. I never told anyone, I said. Matthew knew about the business, of course, but he never fully grasped the scope of it. Michael knew I managed some properties, but I never bothered him with the details. I built this quietly and privately, without fanfare or bragging, because I was raised to believe that work spoke for itself. Jessica stared at the documents in her hands as if they were written in a foreign language. I could see her mind racing, trying to reconcile the woman she had dismissed and diminished for 12 years with the evidence of success that was literally in black and white before her eyes. But you live so simply, she said, and there was something almost plaintive in her voice, as if she were pleading with me to make this make sense according to her understanding of how the world worked. Your house, your car, your clothes, you don't act like someone who has money. No, I agreed. I act like someone who has security. There's a difference, Jessica, though I understand why someone like you might not recognize it. The insult landed exactly as I had intended it to, not cruel but precise, a reminder that her entire judgment of me had been based on superficial markers that revealed more about her values than mine. She flinched slightly, and I could see her struggling to adjust her entire understanding of our relationship. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. And for the first time since I had known her, she sounded genuinely uncertain, as if she no longer trusted her ability to read the situation correctly. "Because," I said, my voice carrying the weight of 12 years of accumulated disappointment, "yesterday at Emma's birthday party, you called me worthless trailer trash in front of my granddaughter. You used my background as a weapon to humiliate me, you dismissed a gift I had carefully chosen for Emma, and you made it clear that you consider my presence in your home to be something your guests should find entertaining rather than welcomed." Jessica's face went from pale to flushed as she realized that I had heard every word of her performance the day before, that I had understood exactly what she was doing and why. She opened her mouth to speak, probably to offer some kind of explanation or justification, but I held up my hand to stop her. "I'm not finished, I said, and there was something in my tone that made her close her mouth and listen. "For 12 years, I have watched you systematically try to erase me from my son's life and my grandchildren's lives. You have excluded me from the family gatherings, limited my access to Emma and David, and consistently portrayed me as an embarrassment to be managed rather than a grandmother to be cherished. You have used my love for Michael and the children as a weapon against me, knowing that I would tolerate almost any treatment rather than create conflict that might hurt them." I paused, letting the words settle between us, watching her face as she began to understand that this wasn't going to be the kind of conversation she had expected to have. "But what you never understood, Jessica, is that my tolerance was a choice, not a weakness. I allowed you to treat me poorly because I believed that eventually you would recognize my worth and choose to build a real relationship with me. I was patient with your cruelty because I hoped that love and persistence would eventually overcome your prejudices." Jessica was standing very still now, the documents clutched in her hands, her eyes fixed on my face with an expression I had never seen before. Not the artificial sweetness or the barely concealed contempt, but something that looked almost like fear. "I was wrong, I continued. You don't want a relationship with me. You want me to stay in what you see as my proper place, grateful for whatever scraps of attention you choose to throw my way, apologetic for existing, invisible except when you need someone to diminish in order to make yourself feel superior." I took a step closer to her, close enough that she had to look up to meet my eyes, close enough that she couldn't miss the steel that had always been there beneath my accommodating exterior. "But I am not worthless, Jessica. I am not trailer trash. I am a woman who built a multi-million-dollar business from nothing, who owns the neighborhood you're so desperate to belong to, who has more financial security than you and Michael could accumulate in several lifetimes. And I am done pretending to be less than I am in order to make you comfortable." The silence stretched between us for what felt like a very long time. I could see Jessica's mind working frantically, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation, how to maintain her position of authority in a dynamic that had just been completely overturned. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and uncertain in a way that I had never heard before. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want what any grandmother wants," I said simply. "I want to be part of my grandchildren's lives. I want to be invited to family gatherings and included in important decisions about Emma and David's activities and education. I want to be treated with the basic respect that any family member deserves, not managed like an embarrassing relative who needs to be carefully controlled." Jessica nodded quickly, too quickly, as if she were eager to agree to anything that might restore some semblance of normalcy to the conversation. "Of course," she said. "Absolutely. I think there may have been some misunderstandings." "No," I said, cutting her off before she could begin rewriting history to make herself the victim of miscommunication rather than the architect of deliberate cruelty. "There have been no misunderstandings, Jessica. You have consistently and deliberately marginalized me because you were embarrassed by my background and because you believed I had no power to change the situation. You were wrong about both of those things." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a business card, the new ones I had ordered with Sinclair Properties in elegant lettering and my contact information clearly displayed. "This is who I am," I said, holding the card out to her. "This is who I have always been, even when you chose not to see it. From now on, I expect to be treated accordingly." Jessica took the card with trembling fingers, staring at it as if it might disappear if she looked away. I could see her struggling to process not just the information but the implications. For her marriage, for her social standing, for the comfortable narrative she had built about her place in the family hierarchy. "I need to go," she said finally, her voice barely audible. I need to think about this." "You do that," I said pleasantly. "And Jessica? The next family gathering is Thanksgiving, 6 weeks from now. I'll expect to be invited properly, not as an afterthought. I'll expect to arrive when the other guests arrive and leave when the party ends, and I'll expect my grandchildren to be allowed to spend time with me without supervision or time limits." She nodded again, still clutching the documents and the business card, and walked back to her car without another word. I watched her drive away, noting the careful way she navigated the turn onto Maple Street, as if she were afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile new reality she was trying to understand. After she left, I went back to planting my tulip bulbs, taking satisfaction in the simple, methodical work of preparing for spring. The conversation had gone exactly as I had expected it to. Jessica was not stupid, just entitled, and once she understood the true dynamics of our relationship, she would make the necessary adjustments to protect her own interests. But more importantly, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The deep, quiet satisfaction of finally standing in my own power, of refusing to diminish myself to accommodate someone else's limitations, of claiming the respect that I had always deserved but had been too patient to demand. The changes that followed were swift and dramatic. Within a week, I received a phone call from Jessica, her voice carefully controlled but lacking any trace of her former condescension. She wanted to invite me to dinner the following Sunday, she said, just family, so that we could start fresh and discuss Thanksgiving plans. The invitation was extended with the kind of cautious politeness that people use when they're not entirely sure of their ground, and I accepted it with equal formality. That Sunday dinner was a fascinating study in social dynamics. Jessica had clearly spent considerable time coaching Michael and the children on how to behave, though she needn't have worried. Michael was genuinely excited to share what he had learned about my business with his family, and Emma and David were simply happy to have their grandmother at the table without the usual undercurrent of tension that had characterized our previous interactions. The conversation was stilted at first, with Jessica clearly unsure of how to relate to me now that she understood who she was actually dealing with. But gradually, as the evening progressed, something interesting began to happen. Without the need to perform superiority or manage my presence, Jessica began to relax into what might have been the beginning of an authentic relationship. She asked genuine questions about my work, listened to my answers without condescension, and even shared some details about her own part-time job at the marketing firm that she had previously considered too mundane to mention. I found myself cautiously hopeful that we might be able to build something real between us based on mutual respect rather than the toxic dynamic that had poisoned our family relationships for so many years. It wouldn't be easy. 12 years of accumulated hurt and mistrust doesn't disappear overnight. But for the first time since Jessica had become part of our family, I felt like we were at least operating from a foundation of honesty. The children, meanwhile, seemed to bloom in the absence of the carefully managed interactions that had previously defined their relationship with me. Emma showed me her recent artwork with an enthusiasm that hadn't been dampened by suggestions that her grandmother's gifts were too advanced for her. David shared stories about school and his friends without the careful editing that had previously characterized his conversations with me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was getting to know my grandchildren as they actually were, rather than as the carefully supervised versions that Jessica had allowed me to see. The real test came 3 weeks later when Linda Patterson, Jessica's friend and unknown to her until recently, my tenant, called to invite me to her book club meeting. It was clear that the invitation was motivated more by curiosity than friendship, but it represented something significant. The beginning of my integration into the social circles that Jessica had spent years keeping me away from. I accepted the invitation and spent an interesting evening discussing contemporary fiction with a group of women who were clearly struggling to reconcile their previous assumptions about me with their new understanding of my circumstances. The conversation was polite but careful, with everyone working hard to avoid the kind of casual condescension that might have characterized their interactions with me in the past. But what struck me most was the way Jessica behaved during that meeting. Instead of using my presence as an opportunity to perform magnanimity or explain my colorful background to her friends, she simply introduced me as her mother-in-law and allowed me to speak for myself. It was such a small thing, really, but it represented a fundamental shift in how she saw me and my place in her world. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect. There were still moments when I could see Jessica struggling with old habits, still times when she had to consciously choose respect over condescension. But the framework of our relationship had fundamentally changed, and with it, my access to my grandchildren and my place in the family. Thanksgiving that year was everything I had hoped it would be. I arrived when the other guests arrived, helped with the cooking and serving in the way that felt natural rather than dutiful, and stayed until the evening was truly over. Emma and David sat beside me during dinner, chattering about their school projects, and their friends asking me questions about my work and my life, with the kind of open curiosity that children show when they're allowed to form their own relationships without adult interference. But perhaps the most significant moment came when Jessica's mother, who had driven up from Florida for the holiday, made a comment about how nice it was to see the family getting along so well. Jessica looked across the table at me, and for just a moment, I saw something that might have been genuine gratitude in her eyes. "Yes," she said quietly, "it is." I understood that this was as close to an apology as I was likely to get, and perhaps as close as I needed. Jessica would never admit to the years of systematic cruelty, would never acknowledge the damage she had done to our family relationships, would never take responsibility for the pain she had caused. But she had made the practical adjustments necessary to treat me with basic respect, and that was enough to rebuild a foundation for moving forward. The holidays that followed established a new pattern for our family interactions. I was included in plans from the beginning rather than added as an afterthought. My opinions about the children's activities and education were solicited and respected. My gifts were received with enthusiasm rather than managed with condescension. Most importantly, my relationship with Emma and David was allowed to develop naturally, without the constant supervision and limitation that had previously characterized our interactions. In February, Emma asked if she could spend a weekend at my house, something that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. Jessica agreed without hesitation, and we spent 2 days working on art projects, cooking together, and talking about everything from school friendships to career aspirations. Emma was fascinated by the story of how I had built my business, asking detailed questions about property management and investment strategies that revealed a sharp mind and a natural interest in financial planning. "Grandma," she said as we were making dinner on Saturday night, "Jessica's mom always talks about how important it is to marry well. But you didn't just marry well, you built well. You made yourself secure." The observation was so mature, so insightful, that I had to stop stirring the soup for a moment to compose myself. This was exactly the kind of conversation I had hoped to have with my granddaughter, exactly the kind of wisdom I had wanted to share, exactly the kind of relationship that Jessica's management had prevented us from developing. "Yes," I said, turning to look at Emma's serious 11-year-old face. "Security isn't something that someone else can give you, sweetheart. It's something you build for yourself, one decision at a time." "Is that why you never told anyone about the houses? Because you wanted to be secure first and impressive second?" I smiled at her perceptiveness. "Something like that. I wanted to make sure that my success was real and solid before I worried about whether other people recognized it." Emma nodded thoughtfully, already absorbing lessons about the difference between authentic achievement and social performance that many adults never learn. This was why I had fought for this relationship, why I had been willing to disrupt the family's comfortable dysfunction, not just for my own sake, but for the opportunity to pass on the wisdom I had accumulated over 7 decades of building a life worth living. Spring brought new developments as I continued to expand my direct involvement in managing my properties. I hired Emma to help me with some basic data entry during her spring break, paying her a proper wage and teaching her about business organization, and customer service. Jessica not only didn't object, but actually seemed proud that her daughter was learning practical skills from her grandmother. The change in Jessica's attitude was most evident in how she talked about me to other people. Instead of the careful management of my image that had characterized her previous behavior, she began mentioning my business accomplishments in casual conversation, introducing me to new people as Michael's mother, who owns half the neighborhood, sharing my advice about property investment with friends who were considering real estate purchases. It wasn't that she had suddenly become a different person. Jessica was still status conscious and appearance focused, still more concerned with social positioning than I would ever be, but she had learned to see my success as something that enhanced rather than threatened her own position, and she had discovered that having a successful mother-in-law was actually a social asset rather than a liability. By summer, our relationship had settled into something that might have been called friendship, though it was friendship built on mutual respect rather than natural affinity. We would never be intimately close, our values and personalities were too different for that, but we had found a way to coexist peacefully and even supportively within the same family structure. The real victory, though, was in my relationship with my grandchildren. Emma and David spent increasing amounts of time at my house, helping with property inspections, learning about budgeting and planning, absorbing the kinds of practical life lessons that I had always wanted to share with them. They were proud of their grandmother's accomplishments in a way that would have been impossible when Jessica was actively managing their perceptions of me. In August, David announced that he wanted to start a small business selling lemonade and homemade cookies, and he asked if I would be his business advisor. We spent hours developing a business plan, calculating costs and profits, discussing customer service and quality control. When he opened his stand on the corner near the elementary school, he had professional-looking signs, a detailed understanding of his profit margins, and the kind of confidence that comes from feeling genuinely supported in your endeavors. Jessica not only supported the project, but helped him promote it through her social media accounts, proudly describing how his brilliant grandmother had taught him to think like an entrepreneur. It was a far cry from the woman who had once dismissed my work as little jobs and hidden my business accomplishments from her friends. As the first anniversary of our confrontation approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. The changes in our family dynamics had been profound, but they had also revealed something important about the nature of respect and relationships. For 12 years, I had tried to earn Jessica's acceptance through patience and accommodation, believing that love and persistence would eventually overcome her prejudices. But what I had learned was that some people only respect power, and that my willingness to be invisible had been interpreted not as generosity, but as proof that I was someone who could be safely dismissed. It wasn't until I had demonstrated that I had both the ability and the willingness to disrupt her comfortable world that Jessica had been motivated to treat me with basic human decency. The lesson wasn't that kindness was useless or that power was everything, but that authentic relationships required honest communication about boundaries and expectations. By hiding my success and tolerating poor treatment, I had enabled Jessica's worst instincts and deprived her of the opportunity to relate to me as I actually was, rather than as she assumed me to be. Now, as I sat in my modest kitchen on a quiet September evening, reviewing the financial reports for my properties and planning Emma's next business lesson, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from finally living authentically. I was no longer performing poverty or success for anyone else's comfort. I was simply being who I had always been, a woman who had built security through hard work and careful planning, who loved her family fiercely but refused to sacrifice her dignity for their approval, who understood that true power came not from dominance, but from the freedom to make choices based on her own values rather than others' expectations. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Jessica, calling to discuss Thanksgiving plans and to ask if I thought Emma was ready to help with more advanced aspects of property management during winter break. Her tone was warm and respectful, carrying none of the artificial sweetness or barely concealed contempt that had characterized our interactions for so many years. "Of course," I said, already planning the lessons I would teach my granddaughter about tenant relations and property maintenance. "Emma has excellent instincts for this kind of work." "She gets that from you," Jessica said, and there was genuine admiration in her voice. "I'm grateful that she has the opportunity to learn from someone with your experience." After we hung up, I returned to my financial reports, but my mind was on the future rather than the numbers. In 2 months, Emma would turn 12, and I was planning to give her a savings account and begin teaching her about investment strategies. David had already expressed interest in expanding his business to include lawn care services, and I was excited to help him develop that plan. These were the kinds of relationships I had always wanted with my grandchildren, not the carefully supervised interactions that Jessica had once imposed, but genuine mentoring relationships built on mutual respect and shared interests. These were the kinds of conversations I had always wanted to have with my daughter-in-law, not the diplomatic exchanges designed to avoid conflict, but honest discussions about family goals and business opportunities. I had spent 12 years trying to earn my place in this family through accommodation and patience. It had taken a single moment of clarity, standing in Jessica's backyard listening to her describe me as entertainment for her friends, to understand that my place was not something to be earned, but something to be claimed. The transformation hadn't required cruelty or revenge, just transparency. I hadn't destroyed Jessica's world. I had simply revealed my own. I hadn't punished her for years of poor treatment. I had simply refused to accept that treatment going forward. I hadn't demanded apologies or acknowledgement of past wrongs. I had simply insisted on respect for future interactions. And in doing so, I had reclaimed not just my relationship with my family, but my own sense of identity and worth. I was no longer the invisible woman who cleaned other people's houses and accepted whatever scraps of attention they chose to offer. I was Samantha Eleanor Sinclair, businesswoman and grandmother, someone whose opinions mattered and whose presence was valued, someone who had built something meaningful and lasting through decades of careful work and strategic thinking. The tulips I had planted the day of our confrontation were beginning to show green shoots in the garden, preparing for their spring emergence. Like those bulbs, I had spent years growing quietly underground, building strength and resources that weren't visible on the surface. And like those flowers, I had finally chosen the right moment to break through into the light, to show the world who I had been all along. As I closed my laptop and prepared for bed, I thought about the phone call I would make tomorrow to Mark Gray, discussing the trust fund I was establishing for Emma and David's education. I thought about the property inspection I had scheduled for Tuesday, and the tenant meeting I would conduct on Wednesday, and the family dinner Jessica was hosting on Saturday, where I would be welcomed as an honored guest rather than a managed obligation. I thought about the woman I had been a year ago, patient and accommodating and slowly disappearing under the weight of other people's expectations, and the woman I was now, visible and respected, and finally, fully myself. The journey from one to the other hadn't required becoming someone different. It had simply required revealing who I had always been. And as I turned off the lights and settled into bed in my modest house on Maple Street, the house that sat in the center of a neighborhood I owned, surrounded by families who now understood exactly who their quiet neighbor really was, I felt the deep peace that comes from finally living in complete alignment with your own truth. I was 71 years old, and I was finally done hiding.